Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy EV. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and my co host, Neil Rydell, with me. Today, we're excited. We have Plug in America's Executive Director, Joel Levin, on the program. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We are super excited to have you here and to hear what you have to say. Why don't we start out by talking about what's on the minds of EV drivers?
Sure. Plug in America, we are the national consumer voice for electric vehicles. We are a membership organization of EV drivers around the country. And, EV drivers in general are very, very enthusiastic about their cars. People love driving EVs for a long list of reasons that you probably are already familiar with. If you say, what are people concerned about right now? Um, the the charging network, the public charging network, is a bit of a challenge for people because it's not as reliable as it should be. We're getting there. The federal government is making some big investments into the charging, and it's taking a little while to get the all the steel in the ground, but we're getting there slowly. So people are a little apprehensive about long distance charging, but I think it is steadily improving.
So I'm genuinely curious about the kind of driver that's dropped in electric vehicles over with you. Here in the UK, we've seen certain driver groups, middle or higher income drivers, particularly those who are sort of green or environmentally minded, and particularly the tech savvy as well, jumping into electric vehicles. Do you see similar trends, or are there different incentives driving people into electric vehicles?
Well, that's who started out. The early adopters were definitely people that were somewhat higher income, that were very like tech forward, wanted to have the latest and the greatest. I think that, we're now about 8% of the market in the US, which is behind Europe, but, catching up. And we're moving beyond early adopters into what I would call sort of the early mass majority, people that don't necessarily need to have the latest and greatest, but are sort of tech forward, are interested in having what's out there, and they're talking to their friends about what their friends are driving. Um, so I think we're moving somewhat beyond that to people that just want a reliable car and they're interested in an EV because they have friends that have an EV, and or they've a family member and they've seen it. So we're moving a little bit beyond that now, which in some sense it makes it harder because the early adopters were very forgiving. People who wanted to have the first new EV on their block were a little bit flexible if there were inconveniences. Now we're moving into an area where people just want a car that's reliable and gets them where they want to go, and they're less forgiving if there's issues or if the charging network is a pain. So that becomes more challenging. We're also getting more and more EVs into the used market, which is something that I'm particularly interested and excited in because um, EVs are so. Consumer Reports did a study about a year ago about the relative uh, benefits of an EV versus a gas car, and they found that um, when you compared a number of EVs back to back with equivalent gas cars, the EV over the total life of ownership was cheaper, was like not a little cheaper, but like a lot cheaper when you added in the cost of fuel and the cost of maintenance. Um, However, most of that benefit actually accrued to the second owner, not the first owner, because over time, the benefits of the fact that they're pretty low maintenance and the fuel is cheaper really add up. And they particularly add up for people that tend to buy older cars and hold them for a long time. And that's sort of a secret about EVs. People don't realize that. But as there's more and more EVs on the market, and there's starting to be more mileage and kind of cheaper price points, there's there's more people in the used market getting into EVs, and I think that's really interesting. That it sort of breaks this myth that these are just like kind of fancy cars for rich people.
So the used market is interesting to me because growing up around combustion engines, we all kind of had our theory of how we bought a used car. I remember buying my first used car and what to look for. Was there going to be oil in the driveway, or whatever you could afford at whatever budget point you were at? Um, do the general public have the skills to go buy a used EV because it's not the same as what your father taught you?
It's different. It's easier, I would argue, but you look for different things. I mean, it's really all about battery health. I mean, aside from the tires and brakes and, general the um, wear and tear on the body, it's really about battery health. If you have a car that has that the battery is in good shape and it still has most of its capacity, you've got a good car that's going to last you many years. If it's a car that's the battery's really degraded, let's say the owner lived in a really hot area and supercharged it all the time, and it's taken wear and tear on the battery, you want to be more cautious. But if you compare that with a gas car, where you've got all these moving parts that have wear and tear on them and wear out over time, and so you need to know the condition of the engine and the spark plugs and the transmission and all the belts and hoses and everything. EVs are, I would argue, a used EV is much simpler to buy. You've got this kind of one big component that you need to have a picture of.
So I was debating this battery health question the other day with a major online car marketplace that sells secondhand electric vehicles. And the
Uh,
debate they were having internally is, do we do a standard battery health check for every vehicle or do we not? And I was intrigued that they are debating this because surely you want that as a secondhand car buyer. You want to see that information. But they were making a case to say, we don't have a secondhand engine life assessment. So why have a secondhand battery life assessment? What's your view? Should we do it?
I think it'd be useful. I think there's companies that are trying to do that. Like I think there's one called Recurrent that evaluates batteries, and I imagine there's probably others that are popping up because with a used EV, it's the most important thing. I know that for car dealers, it's an area where they're trying to build some expertise because they get trade-ins constantly, and being able to properly value trade-in is really important because with a gas car, how you evaluate a trade-in is really different than with a used EV. And so having that skill set is really a big deal for a car dealer.
So clearly, there's a lot of concern sat around this journey that people are going on as they move to electric vehicles, and you're the national consumer voice. What does Plug in America then do?
Uh, what do we do in terms of supporting people? So we do a couple of things. In we're involved with policy discussions at the national and state level mostly, where when the governments are trying to define policies around EVs or when they're spending money on charging infrastructure or creating incentives, we want to make sure that those are designed in ways that benefit consumers and actually get people into the cars and aren't just kind of a boondoggle for charging networks or manufacturers. Um, then we also do a lot of brand neutral public awareness and education around EVs. So we're very well known for Drive Electric Earth Month, which is the whole month of April coming up, actually, and National Drive Electric Week, which is the end of September. And those campaigns have hundreds of events around the country. You can find either of those campaigns, you could just Google them, and the website will pop up for Drive Electric Earth Month or National Drive Electric Week. And so those between the two of them, we have about 500 events that go on all the way from coast to coast, pretty much everywhere, that are put on by EV enthusiasts, local car clubs, cities, utilities, environmental groups, where people bring out electric vehicles and you can test drive them or go for rides in a non-sales environment where people aren't pressuring you to buy a car, and you can talk to real EV drivers about their experiences owning the car. Um, we found that the best way for people to get educated around EVs is if you can actually test drive a few of the cars and talk to a real owner about their experience. That's very powerful and gives people confidence in the vehicles and kind of get a sense of what they like and what they don't like. So we do those. We have a website that walks you through the whole shopping experience called plugstar.com that allows you to compare different vehicles, look at different types of charging that you could buy for your house, figure out what incentives you're eligible for, see dealers that sell those cars, and it's all brand neutral. We don't take advertising. It's intended to be a very objective look at the market. And then we put out a variety of different publications that give people tips and suggestions about shopping for an EV or how to use their car. So we do a bunch of things that are intended to be beneficial for consumers, and they're really EV drivers talking to other EV drivers. We're not trying to sell you anything. We're trying to educate people.
Now, you make 2 points in your closing there. One is EV drivers talking to other EV drivers, and the second was kind of education. Is is the Department of Motor Vehicle up to speed? When I go take a driving test and I show up in an EV, what experience is that person rating me know about EV, and what do I need to know different for state driving licenses? Is there anything they should be teaching me different?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Um, I don't think that it's a radically different thing. There's millions of people on the road now who've driven EVs, so I don't think it really changes things significantly in terms of driving a vehicle. So yeah, I wouldn't imagine it
You
does.
don't.
One of the things we've started to see here in the UK is that people really like EVs because there's this massive torque, there's this massive power, and suddenly everyone and anyone can own a supercar. And the consequence of that is you've got people who are perhaps driving a little bit differently. Their behavior changes, particularly when they're new into that vehicle and they shoot off at the lights and bump, hey, you've got a prang. And we've started to see the implications of that through insurance costs. So we're now seeing insurance costs rising across the board. There's a number of different reasons sat behind that. Have you started to see something similar with you guys?
Well, we've seen that uh, Teslas are a little bit more expensive to repair than other vehicles. Anecdotally, you hear that it takes a long time to get parts for them because the Tesla factories are all basically working flat out. There was a recent situation where um, one of the major rent-a-car companies announced that they were selling off a lot of Teslas from their fleet because of the expense of repairing them. Um, so I don't know that it's all EVs are that people are getting into more accidents. I think it's that with Teslas in particular, they've been more expensive to repair. But I think that that's partly that repair shops don't know how to deal with them and are struggling a little bit. So we've heard a lot of anecdotal stories where a car is in a fender bender and they decide to total out the car because they're worried that it might have created damage to the battery. And for a very minor accident, they total the car. And that I think as repair shops get more sophisticated about dealing with EVs, I think some of those costs will go down. Um, do people drive more erratically in EVs? On the whole, I don't think so. I haven't heard that as an issue. I mean, in general, there's this issue in the US, and I don't know if this is true in the UK, where people are driving crazier since COVID. I absolutely see that there's just a lot more kind of scofflaw behavior, people shooting through red lights and cutting people off and sort of bad behavior. I don't think that has anything to do with EVs. I just think there's a general decrease in civility in our society that we need to deal with.
So the U.S. we're a car culture, and we do vacations. I've spent 4 years living in Europe,
Uh-huh.
and now I live back in the U.S. again. And in the U.S., we think nothing of popping our family in the car and driving to Disney World or somewhere across the states.
Mhm.
These long trips. Are the EVs ready for this today in that lifestyle?
So I would say that it depends where you're going. The best thing that you can do is if you're going to go on a large road trip, plan it out in advance on one of the major planning apps like PlugShare or a Better Route Planner or something like that, and take a look at where you're going to go and what the charging network looks like. So, for example, my sister just did a road trip in an EV from Denver to San Francisco, and there were sort of two major routes that she could take. And she spent a little bit of time with a route planner and realized that one of them, the charging was pretty good, and the other one, it was a lot sketchier. And so she took the route with good charging and it was fine. She had a good trip. So I think that you need to do a little bit of pre-planning. Certainly, the reputation is that it's easier in a Tesla because of the Tesla network, so people prefer that. But it doesn't mean that you can't drive on the public network. You just need to sort of plan it out in advance and make sure you know where you're going. On major highways, it's generally easier. On the interstates, if you're going to be doing a lot of back roads, it could be trickier, and you might want to rely more on like destination charging, like if you're going to be doing some back roads, but you're going to a hotel that offers EV charging, then you can fill up overnight. That could be a solution.
All right. And I'd assume that most of our driving is local driving, not these long trips.
Hmm.
And many people are apartment dwellers. How are we doing on charging if I live in a multi-family or multi tenant unit?
So it depends. It can be challenging. Some newer apartment buildings are being built with charging in them. Older buildings, some are getting retrofitted, but many aren't because it can be really expensive and difficult to retrofit an old building. So there are a few different solutions that are emerging. Some cities are focusing on putting in um, like curbside charging that is close to dense areas of apartment buildings. So, and like Los Angeles, where I live, the city is putting in curbside charging in areas where there's a lot of apartments, so that that can be a pretty good substitute to having charging in your house. Um, Workplace charging also is a great substitute. So if you can't charge at home, but there's charging at your work or close to your work, where your car is parked for 8 hours every day, that can be a good solution as well. So apartments are a big challenge because um, obviously we've seen the biggest uptake today has been in people who live in single family homes for the obvious reason that it's cheaper and more convenient. Depending on your situation, you can get around that with an apartment. You can come up with good solutions, but some people it's more challenging, particularly if you don't have a parking space, and so you're always parking on the street every night. And if you can't charge at work, and there isn't any good public charging near you, for some people it can be a challenge. So we're not there yet. There's no silver bullet. I'd say there's lots of silver buckshot, if you will, but not not for everybody. For some people, but we're still working on that.
Yeah, this is a fascinating challenge here in the UK. We've got lots of terraced houses, and we're constantly coming up with innovation to put it under the curb, put it through the street, hang it over the top, charge arm from Nodum, connect it to a lamppost, the guys at Chargy who were on the show previously. But this is all driven by innovators, small enterprises building new businesses to overcome these challenges. Do you have a lot of that sort of innovation, entrepreneurship ecosystem in the US overcoming specific city by city challenges?
Yes, there's some of it. It's not as developed as I would like. We're actually working on putting together a sort of database of all examples of like that, of the various different solutions that people have for apartment buildings. Um, so there's some innovation going on, but we're gonna need a lot more of it. And so I think there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs and to come in and come up with clever solutions. We are big fans of level one in a lot of cases. People ignore that, but if your car is going to be parked overnight and you're not someone who has to commute 100 miles every day, a lot of times a plain old plug works just great. If your daily commute is less than 40 miles, and there's, let's say you park in a garage and there's just a regular wall plug on the other side of the garage, that might be a totally adequate solution. So level one sometimes is this simple, dumb, basic solution that works pretty good for a lot of people. So I would not disregard that. People tend to forget about it because the charging networks, everyone thinks, oh, faster is better. Faster is more expensive too. Sometimes slow works pretty good for a lot of situations.
And
Yeah,
then the level 1 is generally that plug that they buy when I get the car, right? You go in, they say, "Hey, you can go get this plug, you plug it in your garage. You're not doing any extensive wiring. I'm literally just plugging into the infrastructure I have." Is that correct?
Yes, level one is just a plain old wall plug that like is probably 5 feet from you right now, where both of you are sitting. Yeah, obviously you can't bring your car into your office, but yeah, there's regular wall plugs everywhere, and every EV can use them.
All right. So Plug America, you focus, you're educating, you're bringing people up on EVs. Do you work on EV charging infrastructure problems? Are you working with policymakers and helping, or how are you involved in this dialogue of what's going to happen with charging infrastructure? Because you just explained a journey going from Denver to LA, and although it's doable, it was one more complication in someone's day if they're taking that trip. So it's not quite prime time for everybody yet.
So we have been pretty involved with the rollout of the federal standards for the NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure. So the federal government has a big chunk of money that is currently being just gradually dispersed to the states to create a national highway infrastructure that is intended along major highways to have um, a charging plaza at least every 50 miles that has a speed of no less than 150 kW with a minimum of at least 4 chargers, and that they're sort of universally accessible to everybody. So states are now putting contracts out for that and putting steel in the ground. Um, the feds have worked very hard on developing standards for it so that it's a uniform charging experience. Our vision, if you think about buying gasoline, not that I'm a fan of buying gasoline, but the experience in the US is very, very uniform. You can take any car and you can go to any gas station in America and you can pull any credit card out of your pocket and you can fuel, and the price is posted and there's generally lighting and there's a bathroom and the pumps work and there's not a big line. So from a consumer perspective, it's a pretty consistent and consumer friendly experience. And that's really what we want with EVs, that you can go to with any EV, you can go to any charging station in the country, pull out a credit card and it works. And there's they're not all broken and there's not a big line, and which is equivalent to the gas station experience or better. The EV experience can be better. I mean, if you look at plug and charge, like what Tesla has and what other manufacturers are starting to have now, where you pull up and you don't need a credit card. You plug in and the station recognizes your car and it just goes. So that's what we're looking for, and I think we're getting there. And the federal standards call for uniformity and call for eventually converting over to plug and charge over time.
So this is really interesting. We saw a lot of debate around the standards and the standardization that was going on over here in the UK. And the one thing that I observed was the original definition included a CCS Type 1 plug, until a bunch of US auto manufacturers turn around and go, no, we don't want to do that. We want to use a
Right.
different standard. And, alongside that standard, the plug and charge capability isn't currently accepted. So where are we with the type of plug that the US is fitting, and what's going to happen with plug and charge?
Well, so there's two different questions. There's plug and charge, and then there's the standard, the shape of the plug. So CCS has been kind of the universal standard in the U.S., except for the Tesla network, because Tesla has its own standard, which they call NACS, the North American Charging Standard, and because of the reliability of the Tesla network. Uh, um, Most of the manufacturers have announced that they are going to migrate over to the Tesla standard, and they're in the process of like working deals with Tesla so that their drivers can use the Tesla network. So I would say that the Department of Energy is kind of scrambling now to accommodate that and figure out how do they revise their rules for NEVI, given that when the rules came out, it seemed like CCS was the winning standard. It was what everyone was going to be using, and now it suddenly appears that it's either going to be some combination of CCS and NACS, or potentially eventually only NACS. So it's a little unclear. So they're revising those standards and what a NEVI station should look like to accommodate that. So that threw kind of a big monkey wrench into the works. But I think it showed that the manufacturers are very concerned about people's dissatisfaction with the public charging network, and the fact that everyone really prefers the reliability of the Tesla network, and they're trying to glom into that. So it's probably going to be for the medium term, some combination of the two, and maybe all charge cars will have. It's relatively easy to use both. You just have like a little adapter that fits on the end of your plug. So.
And do you see something adapting on that North America charging standard to enable it to handle the classic 1511.8 plug and charge standard, or is it going to move into some Tesla dominated ecosystem for charging?
So my understanding is that what would happen if you've got so let's say Ford just announced that they're going to send Tesla adapters to all their drivers, and so there's sort of two things that have to happen. You have to have an adapter, and then the network needs to recognize your vehicle. So like in Europe, that's already happening, and I think in the US that'll probably happen pretty soon, where Tesla will allow non-Tesla drivers to use their network. So presumably Ford has some deal with Tesla that as a Ford driver, you can sign up to the Tesla network, and then you put on your little adapter, and then you can go to any Tesla charger and use it, and Tesla it'll recognize you and send you a statement at the end of the month.
Yeah, that sounds like it's a solution which consumers are crying out for. I think it's one of these
Yeah.
ones which will need to be seen to be believed. I'm conscious that there's a lot more technology behind getting the handshake between the vehicle and the charger to do what it does. And Tesla's beautiful because it's got that integrated system, and we all want that experience. And there's that journey to get there because clearly a Ford and a Tesla might not handshake the way we want them to.
No, you're absolutely right. There's a big risk of different kinds of software incompatibilities that people need to sort out. I mean, Electrify America has had a number of challenges with the reliability of their network, and partly it's because what they're trying to do is much harder than what Tesla did, because they have multiple manufacturers who make their equipment, and they have an open standard where you've got all the different OEMs, and everyone has a little bit of different software, and some of them take longer to verify that the electrons are running, and so it's harder with an open standard like that.
Now, you touched on a couple of points throughout the conversation that are maybe bumps along the road or growing pains.
Huh.
You mentioned Ford. We've talked about the different charging infrastructure. And if I turn on the news these days, the news about EVs in North America is a little disheartening. And depending on how the newscaster frames it, you would think that the big three don't support EVs and that that's going away, and that EVs are not getting adopted in North America. Maybe you could shed some light on it and tell us what's really happening in the markets today in North America.
Sure. I mean, the EV market is actually growing really rapidly. I mean, in last year, I think it grew 42% in the country, something like that, which is a phenomenal level of growth. Um, is it going to slow down somewhat from that? Yeah, probably. But that's what happens as things grow. You can't grow at 42% forever. Uh, I imagine that we'll still have steady growth as a percentage of the market. It'll probably slow down somewhat as it grows over time. That's kind of normal. You can't really have exponential growth when the actual number of cars in the country is not growing that much. So I think it'll continue. The big challenge we have, and the thing that makes the U.S. so different from Europe, is trucks, is pickup trucks. Um, that when you get outside the major cities in the U.S., people drive trucks; they don't drive cars. Sedans are something around 30% or 32% of new car sales in the U.S., and the rest of it is SUVs and trucks. And EVs, in the beginning, because of the cost and size of batteries, were vehicles that were kind of urban. They were smaller vehicles because of battery size. We're now starting to see larger SUVs getting out there. There's the first three-row SUVs hitting the market, like the Kia. Um, there are trucks in the market. There's Ford and Tesla, and GM has a truck that's just been released and starting to scale up. And Dodge is a truck that's coming out the next year or so. Um, and of course the Rivian. So the trucks are a big challenge, and of course people use their trucks intensively. People haul things, and when you we've heard stories that when you attach a big trailer to an electric truck, it you know reduces the mileage, as it does with a gas car as well. And so the manufacturers are responding to that and figuring out different solutions. And I think that's going to be really critical. In some cases, putting in really big batteries. In some cases, having plug-in hybrids that have dual fuel. And so I think figuring out solutions for people outside of the big cities that need heavier duty vehicles is going to be really critical to the U.S. and makes it harder than Europe to really scale up to really hit everybody.
Now, trucks have been the friend of the automaker because they were high profit divisions for most of these, and they kept our auto industry alive for a long time. When we switched to EVs, which are already so expensive, when I looked at a F-150 Lightning, I was super excited about it until I saw the price tag and thought I could buy a house for that. Um, is that going to change the industry? Because are the margins still there on those big SUVs and trucks when you're having an electric vehicle? Is it still profitable for those companies?
I think they'll still be profitable. I mean, it's we've the manufacturers I think have discovered that it's easier to turn a profit on a kind of a more expensive vehicle because there's more profit built in there already, more margin. I mean, if you go look at a fully loaded Ford F-150, regular gasoline truck, that is not a cheap vehicle either. People who like their trucks, trucks can be fairly expensive. So I think that there's margin there. The challenge has been battery cost. That if you're going to put a really big battery into a truck, that gets expensive and cumbersome and heavy. However, battery technology continues to improve, month over month. The you know Bloomberg has been tracking the cost and density of batteries since 2010, and in the last decade, the cost of a battery has dropped about 90%. On average, it drops about 15% a year over time, and the forecast is that that is going to continue. And so, which is why you're seeing vehicles, lots of vehicles on the market that go 300 miles, and you didn't a couple of years ago because batteries are getting cheaper. New LFP batteries are significantly cheaper than regular old lithium-ion batteries with cobalt and nickel in them. Uh, so I think that uh, battery technology will save us. Battery technology will continue to improve, and it'll make it easier to put out these larger vehicles and do it profitably.
It's exactly the kind of messaging we want to hear, because one of the things we constantly get fed back on is that upfront cost. You've already talked about total cost of ownership being lower, but the upfront cost puts a lot of people off. And as a consequence, we need to start to see that number to make Chris happier when he goes and inspects his next truck, that we can get that number down. What else do you see happening that would enable consumers to get in? How do we get in? We talked about the early majority. How do we get into the late majority? What else do we need to do to get that last group over the line?
Right. So yes, in terms of when you buy a vehicle, people are used to just looking at the price. And what we do a lot of dealer education on this, and what we strongly encourage the dealers to do is get people away from that and have people think about the monthly cost of ownership, because that's where an EV shines. When you say, what is it going to cost me every month for my finance payment, my fuel, and my maintenance? And that's where an EV starts to look really different than a gas car, especially if you price that out over a long period of time and you realize that fuel and maintenance look really good 5 years in, 8 years in versus a gas car. So that's really important. And so for consumers, you need to change your mind and don't just think of the upfront cost, which might be more, but then over time, it's going to be very significant savings. Like I said, I pointed out that report from Consumer Reports that when you look at the total cost of ownership, apples to apples of a similar gas car to an EV, the EV is cheaper. It's always cheaper, which is shocking to people.
Now, in our pre-call, you mentioned a book by one of our previous guests and said Plug America was inspired by this book. Who killed the electric car? how does that relate in Chelsea's book relate to Plug America?
Plug in America.
Plug
So
Sorry,
it's not a book; it's a movie.
movie, sorry.
That the so I'll give you a little bit of history of uh, environmental regulation in California, and so I live in Los Angeles. We have an air pollution problem. You've probably heard that, and so the state of California has been pushing to clean up the air in Los Angeles since the 50s. You know, the air here 50, 70 years ago was much worse than it is now. And so there's been this constant pressure from the state of what else can we do to clean the air? Because as the population grows here, you've got to, everything that humans do has got to get cleaner and cleaner over time. Otherwise, this will just not be a place that you can live. And so, about 25 years ago, there was a bunch of research that was done, partly at UC Davis and elsewhere, that showed that electric vehicles were a viable technology, that you could build electric cars that would work as an alternative to gas cars. And so the state of California, the California Air Resources Board, looked at that and they said, "Oh, okay, well, if you can build them, we're going to make you build them." And so they passed a law called the zero emission vehicle mandate, the ZEV mandate, that said that if you're going to sell cars in California, a certain percentage of your vehicles need to be a ZEV, a zero emission vehicle, which can basically means electric or hydrogen, and that has to ramp up over time. And so when the ZEV mandate came into being in the late 90s, a number of manufacturers complied and started to build zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, and in relatively small numbers, a few thousand of them, and consumers loved them. People loved these vehicles, but they were a pain for the manufacturers. There was, and they really weren't very excited about it. So they went back to the state and said, nobody wants these cars. We can't sell them. People don't like them. They're a hassle for us. And so the state relaxed the mandate. And it turned out that they hadn't actually sold any of the cars. They'd leased all of them. And so when the leases came up, they took them back and they crushed them and they destroyed them and got them off the streets. And those handful of people, a few thousand people who had those cars, were really upset. And so they created this movement to try to save the electric cars and to force the state to go forward more with the ZEV mandate. And it initially didn't work, and the EVs kind of disappeared off the streets and they were gone for a long time. There were no commercial EVs for a number of years. And that's when that movie came out, Who Killed the Electric Car, basically trying to figure out why did this happen, that this new technology was there and then it was gone. And then the state came back around and doubled down on the ZEV mandate and has ratcheted up to now where it goes up to 100% by 2035. And you know, to some degree, because of that movement and the regulators of the state of California, EVs are where they are today and have really kind of taken off and around the country and around the world. And so that movie documented that whole history. You can find it on Amazon; it's still available. And the people who were involved in that movement, which again was 20 plus years ago, were some of the founders of Plug in America. So that movement gradually morphed into the organization we have today. We're pretty different, but that's sort of the roots of Plug in America.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate this, Neil. Any final questions or thoughts? That was amazing.
It's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, it was great.
For me, that's an incredibly rich story. And what I really enjoy is when you go to the pluginamerica.org website, you can find a richness of support mechanisms and insight and guidance to help a whole range of roles. And you talked about dealers and drivers and events and getting people in vehicles. And that whole ecosystem has to come together to help people move forward. So it's really fascinating to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for having me on. This has been it's been really fun.
Thank you, Joel. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content. If you did, don't forget to subscribe and follow us. We'll talk to you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV. Bye bye.